Hey, what's up, guys? Thanks for being here first of all. I'm super stoked to do another one of the live stream Patreon only posts. Today we're going to be talking about suspension. Talked about in the tire one. I had you guys send in a few different things, and I kind of figured that the best way to go about this would be to bring some examples in of some different things. So I got a shock, I have a piston with some valving, and then just kind of go over the terminology and give you guys just a really good like base overview of what a spring curve is, what that does, what your compression does, what your rebound does, kind of how valving works, and then how I think about making those adjustments and what you should kind of look for on the trail. So hopefully this goes smooth. I think we should be able to cover it in about 20 to 30 minutes, but I promise it'll be like a really high value video. So I think you'll learn a lot, which is cool. I love suspension. One of my biggest jobs is actually working with SR Sun Tour and the DVO crew and basically helping them develop new suspension. We do everything from talking about different uh, ratios of positive and negative chambers all the way to changing the pistons and changing the valve stacks and kind of trying to get the best ride for the most people is what we always think about. Like not just the top aggressive riders, not just the full beginner riders, just get a good setting that works well for everyone. With that being said, today I just wanted to start by going through this terminology list with you guys and help you understand it a little bit better. And the first thing that we need to understand and that we'll touch on is spring curve. So a lot of times you will hear that term be thrown around, spring curve, or like you'll hear someone say, "Oh, my bike's so progressive," or "Oh, my bike is so linear. I love linear suspension. Coil shocks are linear." You'll hear things like that. What that basically means is they're talking about the rate at which the suspension builds pressure as it goes through its travel. So, say full extension, we had 100 psi in this can. As I compress it, every 1 inch that I go down on a linear one, it would go 100 psi, 200 psi, 300 psi, 400 psi, just as an example. In a progressive shock, it would go 100, 200, 400, 600. So it would build pressure much faster. And what that does is it resists bottoming out and it gives you more what they call end stroke support. So progressive shock, as you get deeper into the travel, more towards here, then you'll have more support. But then at the very start of the travel, you'll have a very light feeling and a lot of like suppleness. So that's why a lot of people like that progressive feel like of air shock because you can get it to be really nice and supple then still resist bottoming. And then some people love the feel of a linear shock, which is very consistent, very smooth. If I hit something at a certain speed, I know kind of what the bike's going to do, and it always feels the same throughout wherever you are in the travel. Curve, basically, when you hear someone say, "I have a linear spring curve," it means that the shock feels like it builds through the travel very, very consistently. A lot of times that's good for people that ride a little bit mellower terrain and they just want to have nice support. So, like on a cross country bike, a lot of times you'll find a little bit more of a linear shock because you want really good support. And then when you do hit something big, you want it to absorb up and over that. More aggressive riders tend to like progressive shocks because as you're riding, you want it to be really supple and absorb a lot of the small chatter bumps and kind of give you the most traction possible. And then when you do hit something big, you want it to still have resistance and kind of build pressure. So you'll see a lot of people kind of mess with the spring curve on their bike. What you can do on a lot of shocks now is like on this shock, you have your positive chamber and you have your negative chamber. And if you're adding spacers, so you're reducing the volume of the positive, then you'll basically make the shock more progressive. If you have a bigger positive and you reduce the volume of the negative, then you'll make the shock more linear. And so it's kind of cool because you can play around a lot with these now. Where on your bike, if you're like, "Oh man, I like how it feels through most of the travel. Like when I'm in my sag, it feels good. When I'm pedaling around on most trails, it feels good. And then when I go off a drop or if I hit something really hard, it just bottoms out like crazy." Then you would want to add one or two spacers to the positive side. If you're in the opposite fact where it's like, "Man, I really like how my bike feels most of the time, but when I hit something big, I'm not using full travel." Like maybe you're getting to there and you don't actually use full travel, like your full travel is here, then you might want to actually either take some out of the positive side or add some to the negative side, and that'll help you kind of achieve that full travel. So that's ways that you can manipulate spring curve. Every bike's different, so it takes a lot of practice to kind of figure out what you need. But on the trail, like I said, if you're bottoming out really easily, you're probably going to want to make your shock more progressive by adding some spacers to the positive. if you are not able to reach full travel, but you're at a good sag level, then you're going to want to make your shock a little bit more linear by either taking some spacers out or reduce or adding spacers to the negative. So I know that's a lot of like technical mumble jumble, but I don't know. It really does help a ton once you can get your bike set up properly. Like on these Niners, they require really progressive shock, and so I have basically my can fully packed with these spacers because I want it to be at 30% sag and be very supple, and then I don't want it to bottom out hard. And the stock setting that they came with was pretty linear, and so I would ride it and it felt pretty good, and then I'd go off like a big drop or into a big hole, and it would just bottom out and be like kind of that metal on metal sound of like the shock fully compressing. So you don't want to hear that too often. You do want to reach bottom out, once or twice a ride usually is kind of a good rule of thumb, but you don't want it to be just like hard metal on metal clack sound all the time. So yeah, hopefully that helps you guys out a little bit. The next thing that we'll touch on is your compression. And a lot of people kind of get these mixed up. So there's two types of compression, and a lot of times on a shock like this, it doesn't have the adjustments, but it still has those two types of compression, and that is controlled by the valving, which we'll go into a little bit later. But I'll kind of just separate what these two do and how you can understand them better. So your low speed compression, just as a rule of thumb, is going to control any low speed movement of the shock shaft. So if your body weight is changing, say you like raise your heels and you weight the front end, that's a slow speed movement. Or if you're braking and your bike starts to settle and dive in the front end, that's a low speed movement. You want to think about how fast is the shock shaft traveling, not how fast is your bike going. So a lot of times what we always think about is low speed compression is controlling your body's movements and basically your body input to the bike. And then high speed compression is the opposite. High speed compression is when you're going along and there's a big hole and your bike just takes a really sudden impact. Then the shock shaft have to move really quickly for a split second. And that is controlled by high speed compression. So, with that being said, what I see a lot of people do is they don't set up their spring curve correctly. So they are bottoming out a lot because they don't have a progressive enough spring curve. And then to try to fight that, they'll start adding a lot of low speed and high speed compression to try to get their bike to stay higher in the travel or to not bottom out as easy. But what you have to remember is that the way that compression damping works and the way that valving works is basically by generating heat and generating energy because you're restricting the flow of something, you're restricting the flow of oil. So what we've always been taught is if you get this right, like if you get your spring curve right and you get your bike set up well with your spring curve, then you can run much lighter compression because you're not reliant on it as much. And then when you get in a sticky situation, you can kind of be like, oh, I'm braking into this corner and I feel like my front end's diving too much. I'm going to add a little bit of low speed compression. Or if you say, hey, my bike is bobbing a little bit in the rear shock when I'm pedaling, add a little bit of low speed compression. But I don't really like to run a lot of high speed compression because you're basically just restricting flow and you're restricting movement, which will heat the shock up faster and it'll kind of make your damping and everything change more throughout the ride. So I'd rather have my spring curve dialed than have a really bad spring curve with a ton of compression. Um, so I hope that kind of helps a little bit. Basically, think about low speed compression as controlling your body's input to the bike. And then high speed compression is the wheels having to get out of the way really quickly, landing off of a drop, going into the face of a jump, hitting big holes. That's your high speed compression. And if you need help, so if your bike is bottoming out really easily, or if it's doing these weird things, you can add high speed compression, but it's not necessarily the ideal way to achieve that. So I would usually recommend changing my spring curve versus just adding a lot of compression. And same kind of goes with rebound too. So a lot of times I'll see people not understand that there's low speed and high speed rebound. And on this shock, for example, there isn't adjusters for each one. But anytime you have a red like rebound knob, just a single knob, that is controlling your low speed rebound. And what that does is because your rebound you would think would be set, right? Like, it's just kind of my shock could compress really quickly or it could compress really slowly, but the rebound is always going to rebound the same. But what you have to think about is like when we talk about this spring curve up here, if you start out 100 psi, so I go in, now I'm at 200, it's going to rebound at a certain rate. If I go all the way down and I have 400, 500 PSI in this air can, it's going to push the shock down really fast. And so that's where you get the two different rebound speeds. Compression is not position sensitive. So, you could have high speed compression happen anywhere. You could have it at the start of the travel, at the end of the travel, anywhere in the travel. You could have a high speed movement. Rebound is position sensitive pretty much because the only way your rebound is going to change is depending on how much pressure you have building on this side of it and how much pressure is pushing back against the rebound. So, therefore, low speed rebound usually is controlling kind of the beginning input into the middle of the travel. So, I would say that low speed rebound is responsible for maybe from here to about here. So you have this much low speed rebound adjustment is what this little red knob does. And then the bottom half of the shock is kind of being controlled by the shims inside or by your high speed rebound adjustment. So when you see people, a lot of times they'll get like kind of bucked off of a jump and they're like, oh, I need to slow my rebound down. It's kind of funny because what they're doing is actually just sacrificing a lot of grip and comfort at the beginning of their travel when they turn this knob, and they don't actually get their rebound to slow down at all for when they do experience that, like on the jump face, your bike bottoms out and unloads. That'll still be the same no matter how much you close this off. So you could have a shock that is like barely moving, and then when you get deep in the travel, it just unloads. That's why it's really important to understand the relationship between low speed rebound and high speed rebound. And that's why when we're doing all this testing, basically we have all the valving, and so low speed is kind of like adjusting that those fine tune adjustments, and then high speed is what we'll do with the valving and change the shims to basically restrict the flow more in certain situations. And I've actually had some shocks where we went the opposite way, where I had my high speed rebound way too slow, and my low speed rebound was good. So the shock felt really good. And then when I had hit like multiple impacts in a row, then the bike would almost feel like it lock out because the shock would just go boom and it couldn't recover. It would take another hit and go boom, and then it couldn't recover and it would take another hit and just get deep in the travel and just kind of lock there. So it's a really fine balance because you want your shock to have fast enough rebound to where it can recover in the air in between those impacts. So if you have a rock here and a rock here, you want your shock to absorb this rock and then fully extend and recover before it absorbs this rock. A lot of times people run the rebound too slow. But I don't know. It's kind of interesting knowing the relationship between those two, and hopefully it helps you guys understand, low speed rebound. Again, this one is position sensitive, so this is kind of the first half of your travel, and then high speed rebound is like the last half of your travel when you have a lot of pressure built up in your shock. And kind of depends too, because say you're a 300-pound rider, then you're going to have more pressure right off the bat, so your shock is going to have less control by using that red knob. If you're a 100-pound rider, then you're not going to build very much pressure. So there's not going to be as much speed pushing against this high speed rebound circuit. So your red knob might control 75% of that shock. So that's why it's kind of interesting just trying to figure out a good balance. And it's cool that a lot of shocks now have those two adjustments because you can independently tune them. But if you're on a jump and you feel like you're getting bucked, a lot of times that is going to be your high speed rebound. If you're on a trail and you feel like you're pedaling and you're kind of bobbing a lot. So like when you're pedaling, it's bobbing like in the rear shock. You might have your rear rebound too fast for low speed because it's basically allowing it to like bounce the whole time, and you want it to almost settle a little bit. So if I'm pedaling and my bike's bobbing a lot, then I'll add a little bit of low speed compression, and maybe I'll add 1 or 2 clicks of low speed rebound. If I'm on a jump and I'm getting bucked, I need to add high speed rebound. And if I am going through a trail and hitting like deep successive impacts. So say you're big rock garden, high speed, and you're going like 4 big impacts in a row, and my bike feels really harsh by that fourth one, then I probably need to lighten my high speed rebound a little bit. So I know again a lot of technical stuff, but hopefully it's interesting. And if you guys have any questions, definitely put them in below, and I'll try to answer for you guys. Again, this is just for Patreon, so it's kind of fun because I can go a little bit deeper on this and then use it as like a test run for if we ever do a video on this later. All right, so we kind of talked about spring rate, we talked about compression, we talked about rebound and the relationships between them all. Again, this is number one most important thing. Compression, I would say, is number 3. This is the least important thing. out of these three, and then rebound is the second most important. When we're talking about the low speed and high speed, one thing I didn't really mention is that if you have a linear shock versus a progressive shock, that will change the rebound character a lot as well. So sometimes it's funny because I'll watch people, um, and they'll put as many spacers as they can in their shock to get it to be as progressive as possible, not understanding that that is going to totally affect their high speed rebound on a jump, because now their shock basically at bottom out when you're on the face of a jump and you're experiencing all that G force. Your shock maybe has 500 psi built into it when it used to only have 3. So now you just increase the speed of the rebound at that part of the stroke because you added more pressure pushing against it. Um, so there's so many little adjustments. It's kind of like photography. You can do ISO, aperture, shutter speed, all these things to get the same effect. So, by changing your spring curve, you can really affect your rebound. By changing your rebound, you can really affect your compression, because it could feel like, oh man, like my bike is too stiff, but really what's happening is it's too slow and it's packing down. So you really have to be a trained eye, or trained, I guess, kind of, I always say trained feet, because that's where you feel most of the impacts is in your feet when you're riding. And I'll basically be riding the whole time and like, okay, what energy is going through my feet into my ankles? And you're kind of like, okay, this is feels really supple. It feels very nice right now. I have a good setup. My bike feels planted. Or, man, this feels really sketchy. It feels like the rebound is packing up, or it feels like the compression is too harsh, or you have that feeling of this feels pretty good. And then you bottom out and you're like, boom, right into your ankles. You're like, okay, I need to add some spacers. So I hope that makes sense a little bit. But the next thing we'll talk about is understanding the valving. And like we said, you have all these adjustments. How are they done? So the way that these are done, it's kind of interesting, and every shock is a little bit different, but there is a pretty consistent way or theory of how this is done. So I have a piston right here. I'll show you guys. But basically, this is a rear shock piston. I kind of have a few different, like this little nut in the center is from a fork. So it's not like perfectly an example, but it's a good theory example. But this is a piston. So these 3 big holes on the outside, so you can see, sorry, you can see these 3 big holes, these long ones. That is the compression side. What that means is that as oil flows through this piston, it's going to go through these 3 big holes. Those are my compression holes. Now, if you look close on this side, you see those 3 small holes. That is the rebound side. And so you'll have your compression side here, and then you have these 3 little holes are your rebound side. And you can see the oil gets kind of forced down into that little spot. So that is your piston. The way that a piston works basically is you have these small metal plates that are called shims, and the shims essentially block those holes. But what's interesting is if you look on the side of the piston, see if you can see this. So if you look on the side, see it's not blocking the rebound holes, which are those small little holes. It's only blocking the compression holes on this side. And then vice versa, on this side, we run like I don't know if I brought the right size shim, but we run a 16. Oh yeah, that's about the right size. So we'll run like a 16. So all 3 of those little holes are blocked, but the compression holes are not. So the way that we isolate compression versus rebound is by blocking off certain holes. So these bigger shims will block off the compression holes. So there's one blocking that. What happens is as oil comes through this, it has to actually bend these shims upward. And so it'll basically push on it and open the shim and allow oil to flow. The way that we build a stack is that we'll have, this one shim, which is, I think this one's probably a 22 by 0.15 millimeter thick. So 22 outer diameter. From there, we'll take like a 20, which is slightly smaller, and we'll put that on there. So that just stiffened the center a little bit more, but it allowed like the very edge to still kind of flex open. From there, if we want to adjust our high speed compression, because most of this, the initial opening is kind of low to mid speed compression. If we want to adjust our high speed, we put another shim that's smaller there. And now as the shims want to bend up, so it's not the best example, but you guys can kind of see there's multiple shims. It's kind of creating a pyramid. But as the shims want to bend upward, there's more and more things stacked here in the center, and it gets stiffer and stiffer and stiffer. So that's how you build a progressive stack. Like at the beginning, flows really nice and openly, and then as it gets and it's kind of pushing more oil faster, it opens like that, but then there's more shims in the center, so it resists that. So that's how we'll adjust the compression rates of certain things and the rebound rates of certain things is by adding, a pyramid stack. So we'll have a bigger shim on the outside, and then it goes smaller, smaller, smaller. And as they get opened more, then you're kind of engaging those smaller shims in the center, and it's adding more and more stiffness. So, yeah, like I said, it's all speed sensitive. That's why compression can happen. It can happen anywhere. You could be halfway through the travel and then it just gets pushed really quickly, or you could be at the beginning of travel, gets pushed really quickly. But at a certain velocity, um, the oil has to push those shims open more and more and more. And that's when you have that progressiveness. And same on the rebound. At a certain velocity, they're pressing through that. But yeah, it's kind of interesting. It's hard to explain like without being hands-on, but one really good analogy someone made that helped me understand it is imagine if you had like a dinner plate in water and you're pushing this plate up and down through the water, like in a swimming pool, just pushing up and down through the water. Now, what happens if you start cutting holes in it? The bigger the hole you have, the easier it's going to flow through the water. The smaller the hole you have, the more restriction you have and the more damping you have. And that's essentially all that you're doing here is you're reducing the amount that the oil can flow, which kind of slows down the piston, and it basically helps turn all that energy of the piston moving through the oil into heat, and then that heat gets dissipated. And yeah, it's kind of just takes the energy from your body into the suspension and then dissipates it as heat, which is pretty cool. So where the crazy thing that happens is the clickers that come into play. So like on the external clicker adjustments, there's really a couple different ones that you'll see, but I'll just put this together. Like I said, this isn't an exact example, I guess, because I'm kind of mix matching a few parts here, but the theory is all the same. So let's just say we have our compression stack built up. Let's see if you guys can see that. So I got our compression stack all built up right here. There you go, you can see it. So we have big shims on the outside, we have small shims on the inside. And then now if you look, there's a hole right down the middle. So what we're doing here is if you have something flowing at really, really low speed, oil is just going to go straight down that hole. And it's basically just going to be free flowing through this little hole. So this is going to be called your low speed hole. The way that we adjust that is we'll have a needle. So there's a tapered needle. This isn't actually the right one, but it's an example again. So you'll have a tapered needle. And as that needle goes deeper into here and it kind of plugs that hole, you're restricting the flow. So that's your low speed compression adjustment. And then as you back this needle out and you get, just a few, tenths of a millimeter away from that opening, you just drastically increase the oil flow, increase the oil flow, increase the oil flow. So that's how we will basically control low speed compression is from that little hole there. And then the way that we do high speed compression is at a certain point, the oil hydro locks and it can't go through that center hole and it starts to go through those shims. And then we build that progressive stack. So the more oil that's flowing, the more those shims are bending, the more they're engaging, and the stiffer it gets. So I don't know. It's really, I'm probably not doing the best job explaining this, but it takes guys like years and years and years to learn all this stuff. And the only reason I learned is SR Sun Tour was cool enough to send me out to Spain for a week. And we did a test camp where all we did the whole week was just ride the same trails over and over and over again. And they had a van set up and we would just get down to the bottom, take our suspension apart, revalve it, go test it. And that was what we did for a full week while we were in Spain. So that's how I learned all that stuff. And it was super fun, super insightful. And it made it really cool because when you're riding on the trail, like I said, I just try to use my feet as feelers and just kind of like, oh man, what's happening to my ankle? How much is it moving? Am I getting those like jarring impacts, or do I feel pretty planted and pretty stable? And yeah, so I don't know if this is helping, but that's kind of how the valving works is you'll build a progressive stack, you'll build a progressive stack. The more oil that's getting forced through the piston, the more these shims need to open and bend. The more they bend, the more shims they engage, the stiffer it gets. And the cool thing is you can not only control this by using, let's see if you can see it again. It's kind of hard to get this to focus right now, but you can kind of see that progressiveness of the stack. So, like big shim to small shim. Not only can you control that by adding more shims, but you can also control the thickness of the shim. So, a lot of times our base shim, which is the base is the first shim on the piston, a lot of times that will be like a 0.15 millimeter thick shim or a zero point 0.2 millimeter thick shim. And theoretically, you can go anywhere from like a zero point 0.1 up to a 0.25. So a 22 by 0.15 is, I think it's 4 times stiffer than a 22 by zero point 0.1, even though you would think that 2.1s would be a zero point 0.2. It's still like a 0.15 is 4 times stiffer. So there's all this weird math that goes into it, but basically what we'll do is we'll be like, okay, what needs to change? I need more high speed compression support. So then I'll look at the smallest shim on here. I'll be like, okay, that's a 13 by 0.15. I'm going to go to a 13.2 and test that. And then if that's not enough, then maybe I'll go to a 14 by zero point 0.2. If that's too much, then I'll go to a 14 by 0.15. And so you kind of just play around a lot with valving. And at the end of the day, if we all had like custom tuned suspension, they wouldn't use any clickers at all because the clickers and the external adjustments actually just are less efficient than just using full shims. So, like on Baja, big trophy truck, Baja 1000 race trucks, they don't even really use external adjustment. They will just have big pistons, like this big around, and they'll just have a ton of shims on it and they'll control everything, get it all dialed. And then that is basically it. So, that is kind of the cool thing about mountain bikes is that we do have all these little tunability features by changing these little low speed compression ports and stuff. But at the very end of the day, the most efficient energy wise that you can get is having a big piston with a lot of shims and controlling everything internally, which is kind of interesting. I always thought that was funny because a lot of times people think, oh, I'm going to have more external adjustments and that's better, but it's not always. And it's funny too because what happens is for low speed, we talked about how it closes off that hole in the center of the piston, basically. High speed external adjustments, for the most part, all they are is there's a spring that sits on top of the shims, and then it just preloads more weight onto the shims. So it doesn't actually do anything except for when you turn that knob, there's a little spring that's just pushing down on all the shims, and it kind of just preloads it more. The only thing about adding preload is it's not through the whole stack. So once you kind of break that preload threshold, then it still has the same problem. So I don't know. It's interesting. I don't really like using external adjustments as much as I can. I try to get everything dialed internally, maybe use 1 or 2 clicks of external max. I don't like to be deep into the adjustment range if I can help it. But yeah, again, a lot of stuff to take in. Hopefully, it's helpful. And I guess now we'll go to making adjustments and like the when. When do you need to make adjustments? So this all kind of goes back to rider feel and preference. That's the biggest thing is you need to understand what you're looking for in your suspension. And what I mean by that is for me, with my riding style, I have always preferred a really planted, supple bike that's really tracks the ground really well and does a lot of the work for me. Um, so I've always liked stuff that is basically pretty progressive with really light, low speed compression, and then decent mid speed compression. And then I really like my rebound to be super fast on the top. And then as I hit something hard, I want it to settle and then fast, settle, fast, settle. So there's some guys that race that want stuff like as stiff as possible. And so they'll run a little bit more linear setup and they'll basically run it really stiff. So they always have feel the whole way down the trail. They'll run a lot of compression. They'll run a lot of rebound, just have it stiff and slow because they just want to do most of the work and have the bike kind of be very consistent. I would rather have the bike do a lot of the work for me because I guess maybe I'm lazy a little bit in that way where I'm like, I'd like to stay planted and just kind of read the terrain and use my brakes and adjust the bike as I'm going through the turns. I don't want to have to be like manhandling the bike the whole time. And so that's what I mean by figuring out what you want. Do you like a stiffer bike? Do you want it to pedal really well? Do you want it to track the ground really well? Because at the end of the day, there's no perfect setup. You'll never really be able to find a perfect setup until maybe in the future when we get into electronics. where basically you have electronic controlled valving that like auto adjusts as you're going through a section. But until that point, you're going to have to compromise. So if you want to have really good traction and suppleness, then you're going to lose feel. If you want to have really good feel, your bike's going to be a little bit more chattery. If you want it to be super efficient pedaling, again, you're going to have a little bit more chatter, less suppleness. And so it's always kind of this trade off. And you say, what do I value the most? For me, what I value the most is traction and stability. And so I always like to have a little bit less low speed compression. I like to have a little bit faster low speed rebound. And then on the high speed compression, the high speed rebound, I just like it to be very consistent. So I have my high speed rebound set. So when I go off a jump or when I go into a big hole, it settles and it doesn't just bounce me out. And then here, I'm more on the progressive side where I want the bike to be really supple for the first 30% of the travel. And then as you go deeper in the travel, it builds pressure and gets kind of more resistance. Um, when you're out on the trail, things to consider are when you're braking, is your bike changing the geometry? So when you're braking, does your front end dive, pushing your weight forward and causing you to change your weight balance and weight the front end more? Because if that does happen, then there's two things you could do there. You could either add a little bit of low speed compression to your fork and start adding, 2 clicks at a time, maybe of low speed compression until you get to the point where your bike, when you're braking, it just stays. So instead of going dive, it goes brake, stays. Or what other people would do is, okay, I'm going to slow down my rear rebound because I want more suppleness. And instead of adding more compression to my fork to get it to stop, I'm going to slow down the rear so that it doesn't rise as much. And so there's little things like that where it's like, what do you want to do? In that case, I would probably add more low speed compression because I like to have my rebound track the ground. But some people are different. Some people think, oh, I'd rather have a slow rear shock so that my bike stays kind of down and it doesn't want to like come up and unweight as much. Um, so that's one really, really good way to see what's going on with your bike is what's happening when you're braking. The other thing is when you're seated, pedaling, riding around town or riding around on flat trails, what's happening to rear shock? Is it bobbing a lot? And by bobbing, do I mean, is it kind of going up and down consistently as you're pedaling and you're losing energy? Because there's a few things you could do there. You could either flip a climb switch, and kind of add the compression and the rebound that way. That's basically all this does is it closes off your compression and your rebound a little bit. Or you can kind of do that manually and be like, hey, most of the stuff I ride is this way. I want to add just a few clicks of low speed compression and I want to add just a few clicks of low speed rebound to get my bike to stop bobbing and just settle. And you'll feel a big difference in efficiency there too. Another thing to look at is when you're going through a section with multiple bumps in a row, what's happening to your bike? Are you consistently getting deeper and deeper in the travel? And what I mean by that is, let me pull this off really quick. But so this would be a good example. But say you hit the first impact and it goes down, and then you hit the second impact and it can't recover. So it just goes down, down. And then you hit the third impact, down again, fourth impact, down again. Now you're basically hitting every bump at, 400, 500 PSI in the shock can, as opposed to if it can recover and then you have 100, like 100, 100, 100, versus if it's just continually kind of getting compressed, it's going to get stiffer by that last bump. So that's one thing to think about too. If it is doing that, chances are your rebound's too slow. That's usually the biggest culprit. When I watch people with their bike setup, they're scared of getting bucked off a jump, so they'd run their rebound really slow, but they don't realize that what they're doing is they're changing their low speed rebound. They're not actually having any effect at all in their high speed because it's preset. And so they're just like compromising 90% of their ride to hopefully save, 10% of their ride on those jumps, but they're actually not affecting it at all. So it's just a compromise without any real benefit. So usually that's what I see is your low speed rebound's too slow. That's one good thing I always tell people is try practicing with it with 1 or 2 clicks more of rebound, so faster rebound. Um, sorry, 1 or 2 clicks less, so open equals faster. Closed, righty tighty is closing the hole, makes it slower. Lefty loosey, opening the hole, makes it faster. So try 1 or 2 clicks of less rebound, see what that does. Same with compression, righty tighty, you're closing the hole, you're making it stiffer. lefty loosey, you're opening the hole, you're allowing more oil to flow, and you're making it more supple. So there's this kind of those little questions that you ask yourself, like, what am I feeling? What am I struggling on? Am I struggling on turns? That's a really big one I see people struggle on. And what they'll have happen, like in turns, a lot of times is that's like one of the one times I will use high speed compression. If you've already gotten your spring rate set and you come into like a berm, and as you're coming through the berm, your bike compresses really hard and changes the angle through the turn, then maybe try adding 1 or 2 clicks of high speed compression. See if that helps. Also, what you could do is if you have that adjustment, that can help. Another thing you could do is add a little bit of high speed rebound so that when it does change, it doesn't kind of unweight. So if you have that adjustment, that can help as well. And yeah, it's kind of just troubleshooting. I think a good thing we could do is if a few of you guys can, if you made it this far into this thing, if you can put in the comments like a section you're struggling on of your local trails, just tell me like, oh, there's like 2 turns in a row. And by the second turn, I feel like this happens. Or there's a rock garden. By the end of the rock garden, I feel like I'm getting squirrely. And a lot of times, like with rock gardens, good example, people come in, they feel good, and then their fork rebound is too slow. And so they go down the rock garden. Here's the rock garden. They'll go do do do. It'll compress, 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 compress. By the end, they have a really steep head angle and they get kind of sketchy and their weight has shifted forward. So in that case, I would tell you, speed up your low speed rebound a little bit on your fork, add a little bit of compression, and maybe try playing around with your spring curve and your air pressure to keep your bike higher in the travel. So it's a really complicated subject, but it's simple to learn, I guess. It's simple to understand that all you're doing is you're closing a hole or you're opening a hole essentially, and you're restricting flow or you're allowing flow. And if you think about it that way, you're kind of like, okay, why is my bike doing this consistently? It's because it doesn't have enough oil flow to get itself back up to the correct position. Or if you're, coming into something and you're getting bucked like crazy, you're like, okay, there's too much oil flow. It's not able to actually restrict itself and give me a nice controlled movement. So that's kind of what I think about. Do I need to restrict flow? Do I need to open the flow? And then, like I said, the number one thing to set up is make sure you get your spring rate set. And I guess last thing before we go, I'll just give you a quick walkthrough of my process of how I set up my bike and what that looks like. So, my procedure when I get a new bike or when April got a new bike, my procedure for getting this set up is number one, I basically open all the clickers. So I'll just open everything, just get the shock to be fully free. Then, after I have the shock fully free, the fork fully free, I will basically have them set their sag, or I will set my own sag. So, have someone hold you up on the bike, bounce a couple times, and then I like to set my sag personally in my standing position. So, in my standing, like kind of neutral attack position. Depending on what you do the most, for me and what I enjoy the most is downhilling and, kind of riding downhill aggressively and having fun, like playing on the trail. Some people that are going to spend most of their ride seated, they might want to like kind of get their baseline for sag in that seated position. So I like to say, set your sag based on what you're spending the most time doing and what you enjoy doing the most. So if you're someone who climbs up fire roads just to go down the hill, then maybe set your sag with you in attack position because then you can have a baseline of like, oh, I need to adjust it here or there. If you're someone who's like more XC type, you have your seat post up the whole time, set your sag in that position. So all that you need to do to set your sag, have someone hold you up, get in whatever position that is, bounce a few times to kind of break the stiction on the suspension, and then have them slide the O-ring. So basically, this will be a bad example, but I'll show you. So what I would do is you're on your bike, it's compressed, your O-rings down here, you're staying in your riding position, your buddy slides this up to the seal, you get off your bike, and then you have that, you'll measure it. And so depending on your bike manufacturer, they should tell you how much sag you should be experiencing in the rear. Just start with that as a ballpark and then kind of go from there. Once you learn your bike more, you're like, oh, actually, I like, I'm going to try 2% more sag or 2% less sag and kind of figure it out. But a lot of people say too to measure your sag while you're in your riding gear. That'll help a lot because that's more realistic of what you're going to be doing on the trail. Um, but that's what I do is I will set the sag and focus on the rear first. The front sag is really, really hard to set because it's so like dynamic. It changes so much, whereas the rear sag is a little bit more static. So what I like to do is set my rear sag at like, 30% for this niner. And then I will have my friend or me, I'll set up my phone on a tripod and I'll just be in my street and I just start bouncing up and down and I'm kind of watching to see, is my bike compressing equally, is my bike compressing front first, is my bike compressing rear first, and I'll adjust my fork to get to the point where it's compressing equally with the rear shock. So as I'm bouncing down up and down on the bike, it's kind of moving equally. So I know that I have a really consistent starting point and I'm not going like this as I bounce and I'm not going like this as I bounce. So I'll set up my iPhone slow mo and just watch. Okay, does it look pretty equal? Yeah. Okay, good. Then from there, I'm going to set my rebound. The way that I set rebound is, basically seat down, seated on the bike, and you ride off of a curb. And as you're seated, you're rolling in, you ride off the edge of a curb. And here's the curb. So you ride off. And as your rear shot goes off, it'll go like this and it'll bounce once or twice. What you want to do is you want to get to the point where as you ride off the curb, your rear shock compresses and it comes back up. It's not just settling and it's not continuing to bounce multiple times. You want it to go off, bounce once, and then settle. So it'll kind of be off the curb, bounce once, settle, and then you're stable. That's how you set like a good starting point for rear rebound. We'll probably do a video on that later, but that's just how I've always done it. Right off the curb, seated, bike compresses, and you don't want it to go like this for multiple times, and you don't want it to just go. That's too slow. This is too fast. You want it to go off the curb, bounce, settle. So one full bounce, settle. And you can again have someone film you on the side, and it'll help you figure that out. Then after I get that, so I got all my adjustments open, I set my sag, rear first, then I watch from the side, make sure that I'm kind of equal front and rear. I will set my rebound before I got on the trail. And then as I'm out on the trail, I'll slowly start adding compression. So you can even do most of this in front of your house again, but just go in a straight line, hit the brakes, watch yourself. Is your bike diving? If it's diving, add a little bit of low speed compression to the fork. If it's not diving, you're probably good. If the rear is like raising, then you might need to add a little bit more rebound. If you're pedaling and the bike's bobbing as you're pedaling, you might need to add a little bit more low speed compression. So you kind of just start troubleshooting that whole thing till you get to a nice baseline. A lot of times the shocks, if you don't want to deal with this part, they will have recommended settings. And so once you get these first things kind of set, which is all, going to be different based on your rider weight and your preference and everything, then you can kind of go in and just start with those base settings if you want to, if you're not sure what you're doing. I like to, like I said, do it kind of by troubleshooting, like, and trying to understand, okay, I'm riding, I hit the brakes, the bike dives, low speed compression in the front. I'm pedaling, it's bobbing. Okay, I need to do a low speed compression and maybe one more click of low speed rebound in the rear. But that's how I like to do it. But they also have all those base adjustments, which help a ton for sure. So man, that was a long one. I guess I did way more than I thought, like 45 minutes. But for anyone who stayed in here, hopefully you could like listen to this as a podcast, maybe or something. Let me know if you do have any questions, and I can maybe even try to, if it's too long, if you guys think it's too long, then I can try to explain this in a shorter amount of time. But it's one of those things that you can't really explain to someone in 20 minutes. Like it's really hard because there's so many nuances, and for me to just do a short explanation. That's why I've been hesitant to do one on YouTube. And this is going to be a good practice actually for doing like a video on there. It's hard to condense all that information down into like something less than, what we just did 45 minutes. I felt like I kind of skimmed over a lot anyways, but yeah, thank you guys for watching. I really appreciate it. Huge thanks for being a Patreon. It's super sick. We love having you guys. Like I said early on, the goal for this whole channel and everything is I really want April to be able to do this like full time with me and us to be able to enjoy each other more. And so the way that we're doing this is I'm trying to get her set up. We have a little bit of Patreon kind of safety net of where it's, monthly revenue we can kind of count on, and that'll help her be able to quit her job. So you guys are directly helping us get to that goal, which I appreciate more than you know. So thank you so much. And like I said, if you have any questions, let me know. Sorry this is so long. Hope it was entertaining at least. And yeah, I'll talk to you guys next time. Thank you.